Hello to all my wonderful constituents out in Maryland's 8th Congressional District and everybody out in Facebook Live land. I've got two remarkable guests with me today, two of my favorite law professors in the world, and actually two of my favorite people in the world. Professor Paul Butler, who's at Georgetown Law School, and my dear friend, Professor Angela Jordan Davis, who's at American University's Washington College of Law. And I wanted to have them both come in because Angela is actually a resident of the 8th District, and Paul's a resident of Washington, D.C., and I want to talk to both of them about where they live. But they've been following things closely, and they are two of the nation's leading experts on criminal justice and two leading experts on criminal justice and police reform. So we've got a lot to learn from them today. And Paul, I thought I would start with you because you've got this remarkable and maybe unique vantage point as a former prosecutor in DC, a former assistant U.S. attorney, and then someone who has become very active in the reform movements and also a law professor at Georgetown. And right before we came on to do this, I saw that a section of 16th Street in DC has been renamed by Mayor Bowser Black Lives Matter Plaza between I think it's H and K on 16th Street. And I wonder just how you're experiencing personally the dramatic changes that we're going through politically in the country right now.
I'm both traumatized and inspired. I'm traumatized because I'm tired of this mess over and over. The question is always, is this a moment or is it a movement? The answer I'm inspired by is it sure looks like a movement. One of the moving things about the protest is that the protesters look like America. They're Black and brown, Asian, Native American. We have the world on our side. People are marching in Tokyo, in Africa, in Europe. And so there does seem to be something transformative about what's going on now. The mayor of Los Angeles is not divesting from the police department, but moving money from locking people up to helping communities be healthy. He's a politician. I think he's doing that because it's the right thing to do, but I think he's also doing that because he's a politician. Not everybody is like Congressman Raskin. Not every politician just does things because they're the right thing to do. So again, I'm inspired by this moment. I'm more optimistic. The concern is we've been here before. Mm-hmm. And the concern is also the trauma of watching another African-American person have his life extinguished by the police.
So thank you for that, Paul. And Professor Davis, let me come to you. And if you don't mind reflecting personally for a moment about what this moment means to you. You grew up in the South, and you've been engaged both as the head of the Public Defender Service in DC and as a renowned professor of criminal law and procedure at the American University's Washington College of Law. You've been involved really at the front lines of these issues. You know, Professor Butler describes being both kind of agonized by the wrenching footage of this cold-blooded murder by Officer Chauvin of George Floyd, but also being inspired by what's taking place in the streets. And I'm wondering how you're experiencing this moment.
Very much the same way as Paul, you know, I mean, and still, I feel sad, angry, frustrated all at once because it just never ends. You know, as you mentioned, and I think about this a lot, the fact that I was, you know, born and raised in the South, grew up in a little town called Phoenix City, Alabama. I grew up, you know, in the late, I was born in 1956. So I grew up living separate accommodations. I remember white and colored signs. I lived through that. And I saw all kinds of horrible examples of racism and racial violence. But, you know, Jamie, it makes me sad that I never dreamed that at the age of 64, in the year 2020, I would see the worst examples of racial violence against Black people. You know, that makes me feel sometimes hopeless, but honestly, like Paul, you know, I was afraid to feel hopeful. I saw the protests all over the place, and I was starting to see, you know, there are more and more white people out there. I mean, maybe this is different. I'm afraid to be hopeful, but then yesterday I saw that there was a protest in a little town outside of Birmingham, Alabama called Mountain Brook, Alabama. It is 97% white and 1% Black. And they had a Black Lives Matter march that was all white because there are no Black people in the town. And 400 people in that little town in Alabama showed up. Mm-hmm. And they had speeches and they had signs and they laid down for the 8.5 minutes that officer had his knee on George Floyd's neck. And I have to believe, like, that was incredible to me. So like Paul, I'm going to go ahead and believe that this time it's different. I have to believe that in order to go on, in order to believe that we have a future, in order to believe that we can change. Maybe not in my lifetime, but maybe we're moving towards that.
Well, there are a remarkable number of protests that are breaking out all over the place, including in my district, in Montgomery County, in Frederick County, in Carroll County. There was one last night at Northwood High School. There's one today in Rockville at Blair High School. As you're saying, they're amazingly diverse. And it's mostly overwhelmingly young people, which gives us profound hope for the future. But I hear from middle-aged people, you know, people my age. I'm hearing from people who live, you know, at Leisure World. They want to be doing stuff too. Now, COVID-19 has depressed the numbers. We're still seeing hundreds of thousands or millions of people across the country going out. And I think that more and more people are venturing out, you know, and I did an episode yesterday of Local Heroes with Dr. Travis Gales, who's the health officer for Montgomery County, who's issuing health advice to people about how to protest safely. So we got to keep that in mind. We also have to bring as much pressure as possible on all the authorities to stop this insane use of pepper gas and tear gas, which cause people to cough and sneeze, and also stop herding people into paddy wagons and, you know, lots of people shoved into a police holding cell where that's a breeding ground for transmission of the disease. But Professor Davis, let me ask you this. There's been so much focus on the police, and rightfully so, after the gory, unforgettable images we saw of Officer Chauvin suffocating George Floyd with his knee. But let's talk about the prosecutors too, because this movement arose when the prosecutors brought in very late some pathetically weak charges that have now been overturned by my former colleague and friend Keith Ellis in Minnesota. But say something about what goes on in prosecuting when you don't have the whole world watching, and what needs to be done to reform the prosecutorial practices. And I should say that you wrote a definitive book on this, Arbitrary Justice, The Power of the American Prosecutor, and more than a decade ago, and it's a classic in the field. But say something about the prosecutors in this discussion.
Well, yeah, the prosecutor plays a key role here. And I think prosecutors' historic and current failure to hold cops accountable is one of the reasons why they feel so emboldened to continue doing what they're doing, because they know they won't be held accountable. prosecutors are the most powerful officials, in my opinion, in the criminal justice system. They decide whether to bring charges or not. They don't have to, they can if they want to, an incredible amount of power and discretion. And unfortunately, and it's very easy for them to bring charges, by the way, probable cause, the lowest standard there is, more probable than not, and they charge people every day, all day, very easily with crimes much less egregious and on way less evidence than they have in these cases where there's clear videotape. So they, of course they can and should charge these police officers, but historically they failed to do that. And frankly, it was actually in the Michael Brown case in Ferguson when people started paying attention to the prosecutor, like, wait a minute, what do you mean the cop isn't going to be charged? This happened. And now, even with all these cases where there's clear videotape, in the vast majority of the cases, the prosecutors have failed to bring charges when they, in every other case, when we're talking about Black and brown people who, again, have committed much less egregious offenses. And by the way, most of these Black men were not committing any offenses at all. That's a whole nother thing. But they easily can bring charges, but they have failed to do so time and time again. And in this last case, this videotape where this man is on videotape, in my opinion, committing first-degree premeditated murder, but that's another discussion, with his knee on this man's neck for almost 9 minutes, where he's saying to him, I can't breathe. And people are standing around him and saying, stop, you are killing him. And he intentionally continued to do that. Where one of his now co-defendants said, should we turn him on his side? And he said, no, don't turn him on his side. I mean, just egregious behavior. And yet it took the people burning down the police station before the Hennepin County prosecutor would even bring charges. They didn't bring any charges at all. It wasn't until, I don't know if that's why, but after they literally burned down the police station, the day after that, he brings these third-degree charges. And again, as you pointed out, and not until the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, came into the prosecution that they actually brought meaningful charges, and then took forever to even, charge the co-defendants. So yes, it is a problem when prosecutors don't do their jobs. They have no problem charging in everyday cases, but when it comes to cops, they're not holding them accountable. That's why we need to hold our prosecutors accountable at the ballot box. Most of them are elected officials. We need to hold them accountable when they are misbehaving like this and not doing their jobs when it comes to police officers and police violence.
So, thank you. Professor Butler, you've written eloquently in your new book, Chokehold, Policing Black Men, which was written before the killing of George Floyd. But you have written eloquently about how people get into a system. You were a prosecutor for the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., part of the Department of Justice, doing criminal prosecution in D.C. And good people go into policing, bad people go into policing too. But you talked about the way in which systemic cultures form, and there develop certain kinds of psyches and mentalities and philosophies of operation. And I wonder if you would pick up on what Professor Davis was just talking about. How do we change the culture of the prosecutors' offices and the police departments so that good people don't end up doing completely terrible and unforgivable things?
So we first have to understand the quality of the problem, how deep and entrenched it is. Compare that opening statement that Professor Davis just gave us in the murder trial of former Officer Clavin with what happened to Mr. Floyd in terms of the arrest. The store owner thought that Mr. Floyd gave him a fake $20 bill. He called the police because that's what his store requires him to do. When the cops got there, he said he didn't know if Mr. Floyd knew that the bill was fake. Mr. Floyd, he told the officers, was around the corner in his car. He also told the officers that he thought that Mr. Floyd was intoxicated. What happens next? 2 officers go on each side of Mr. Floyd's car, one officer says something to Mr. Floyd and takes his gun out and points it at Mr. Floyd. He orders Mr. Floyd to get out of the car. The passengers get out of the car. He puts handcuffs on Mr. Floyd. This is over a fake $20 bill. It's a misdemeanor. And check this out. You're not guilty of the crime unless you have the intent to pass false currency. You know, our criminal legal process is so biased, and we as Black folks face so much discrimination that when things happen to us, I'm never sure if they happen to other people. But for me, it's quite familiar if I pay in cash for the cashier to hold it up, look at it really carefully. And I'm always wondering, well, first, what are they looking for? I would sure like to know. And B, if it is counterfeit, then what happens to me? Because Lord knows I'm not trying to give anybody some fake money. So the reality is there was no basis for the arrest. So it takes literally 5 minutes for the cops to find probable cause to arrest Mr. Floyd. It took 5 days to arrest former Officer Clavin when they had, on my count, they have 7 videotapes. We have 3 videotapes that are floating around. All 4 officers were wearing body cams. We haven't seen those, but we know whatever was on those body cams was enough to get all 4 of those cops fired the next day. So that tells you a lot about how our criminal legal process works. The question you ask is, how can we do better?
Well, and I wonder, Paul, if you would also meditate a little bit on these very sharp disparities in the treatment of different kinds of suspects, as you were just indicating right there, the officer who killed George Floyd, and George Floyd for allegedly having, you know, a small piece of counterfeit currency. But that points at much bigger problems we've got. I mean, look at what happened with Jeffrey Epstein, who was trafficking in underage girls for his own personal pleasure and amusement. And the fix was totally in to protect him from the consequences of his own action. He could have been sent to prison for the rest of his life, but he got this total slap on the wrist, or, you know, I don't even know if I would say it's that. I mean, he got to go to a halfway house for a few hours a day and then go home at night, and he continued doing the exact same criminal activity that he was brought in for. How does he get away with that? How does Attorney General Barr get away with basically acting as a bodyguard for the president as he tramples the free speech rights of the people, the right to peaceably assemble, the right to petition for redress of grievances? I mean, how have we come to this point where everything is so upside down?
There's this wonderful new series called Black AF. It's kind of a riff off the show Blackish. It's about this Black middle income family that still experiences discrimination and frustrations, even though they have a lot of money. And the running joke is this: every kind of episode's about a different experience that they have, but the running joke is that every episode is titled "Because of Slavery." So, Congressman, the answer to your question is because of slavery.
Thank you. Professor Davis, let me come back to you, and I want to pick up on that point that Paul just left us with. We had a reconstruction after the Civil War that lasted for 12 years before it was undone and the federal troops were withdrawn from southern states. We had a second reconstruction during the American Civil Rights Movement, where we passed the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, and there was forward motion there. And that too was undone by a lot of terrible Supreme Court decisions, by the Berger Court and the Rehnquist Court. And it was also undone by a sharp turn to the political right with Nixon and Reagan. Do you think that we are on the precipice, or I'd like to think anyway, we're on the precipice of a third reconstruction, that the massive protest we're seeing, the challenge to racism, really may open us up to the possibility of another transformation? And if so, what are some of the changes we need to see to make this third Reconstruction stick now? And you're free, Professor Davis, to suggest anything you want to talk about. I'm also going to put some stuff out there to see what you think about it. But tell me what's on your mind in terms of the legislative changes we need to see.
Well, Jamie, that's one of the reasons it's so frustrating, because, racism, and specifically the issue we're talking about, the killings of Black and brown bodies, have been going on since slavery, since we arrived on the shores here. And it's never ended, right? From slavery to convict leasing to lynching to Emmett Till in 1955, straight on through Trayvon Martin. I mean, the only thing that's changed now is that we have videotape and social media, but it hasn't helped.
Mm-hmm.
It hasn't helped. That's the thing that's so frightening to all of us. So are we on the verge of a new Reconstruction? I don't know. I hope so. Paul and I both expressed this hope that somehow it's different now. What do we need to do? We need to reimagine and deconstruct this criminal legal system, right? Reform is not enough. We need to think about it in a different way, right? Legislative changes, policy changes, all of the above. But you're a legislator, so let me make some suggestions. Paul started out, and you're a congressman, so of course, you tell me this better than me. I'm not sure how much you as a congressman can do about the state and local police departments, but I have some suggestions. We need to rethink, deconstruct. Paul started out by talking about the mayor of LA. I think you did, Paul. Didn't you mention the mayor of LA, shifting taking $100 to $150 million from the police budget and shifting it over into underserved communities? And that's what we need to start to do. And Congress can do that, right? So there's a program called the COPS program, the Community Oriented Policing Services, acronym COPS. Since 1994, the federal government has put $14 billion with a B dollars into that program. And what have they done? Hired more and more and more cops, more equipment, etc. Most recently, last year, the budget was over $300 million. And this administration launched a program called Operation Relentless Pursuit, in which BAR is now sending federal agents and law enforcement officers into 7 cities around the country. So if there's over-policing, we need to shift that. Why? Well, for a lot of reasons, but for one, we've got police officers arresting people for petty, non-technically offenses, many of them born out of poverty, out of substance abuse, out of mental health issues. Why not take that funding and shift it into services that will deal with the issues that cause people to come into this criminal legal system to start with? That's one of the things that Congress can do, is by shifting those funds or by giving an incentive to police departments. If you don't arrest, if you engage in programs like the one in Seattle called Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, where you're not arresting people at all, you're actually going to just take them to the drug rehabilitation center, not bring people into this system.
Or mental health clinics.
Or a mental health clinic or something like that. So through your funding decisions, you can make a difference. But I think a lot of people in our system that need to think about this different. We've got a small but growing movement of prosecutors now who are running to unseat prosecutors that are over prosecuting. And this new group is saying, we're actually not going to even charge people at all with these minor offenses. We're not going to bring them in the system at all. Prosecutors don't need to be prosecuting these protesters, for example. Letting them don't bring them. So I could go on, but I think those are a few things that can be done now. We need to think big here if we're going to make some changes, because small little reforms, that's not going to do it. We know that from what's happened in the past.
Well, I'm so with you on that. I mean, to do justice, both to the Floyd family and other victims, Breonna Taylor and so many we've seen, as well as to do justice to the people in the streets every day now, every night. I wish I could be there with them, but I've got hearings all day long. And so you know how much I love to go to protests of mine. But
Yes.
but Paul, let me ask you this. so we're working on a big legislative package in the House Judiciary Committee with the Congressional Black Caucus. And I want to just run by some of the planks with you and collect your thoughts, and then we'll come back to you, Professor Davis. But here are the things that I think people are already settling on. Tell me what your reaction is to these. Do you think these are real? Do you think it's that they're basically just symbolic? And what other reforms would you put in there? One is a ban on chokeholds and a ban on other police tactics of asphyxiation to people. It's remarkable how many times we hear this "I can't breathe" protest from people before they die at the hands of abusive cops. Abolition of this qualified immunity doctrine, which is allowing a lot of officers to get away without any liability at all, because the exact factual sequence of their crime had not taken place before. So they're able to say, well, that they're immune because they didn't know. The creation of a national database and list of prosecuted and dismissed and resigned cops in police brutality cases so that they don't resurface in another jurisdiction magically. We're talking about also revitalizing Section 1983 damages, because the doctrines have so narrowed the possibility of getting money damages. And then also the articulation of excessive force standards that we would impose federally as a condition for receiving federal funds at the local level. A lot of jurisdictions do not say that that lethal force or any force can only be used when it's absolutely necessary. After everything else has been tried, the standard is just reasonable force. Was it reasonable or not? And we know you can drive a Mack truck through that kind of standard. So those are some of the things that I see us closing in on over the next couple of weeks. I wonder, Professor Butler, your reaction to that, and if there are other things that seem like they're missing there.
I think that's so important. So all of the above, go for it. Pass it tomorrow. It would make a difference. Even if it were only symbolic, and I don't think these are, the symbol would be huge for the Congress of the United States to say to officers, stop that chokehold. The title of my book is Chokehold: Policing Black Men. I have a wonderful publisher who is wants to get ideas out for the public interest. Publishers are also interested in selling books. And when my book came out, the publisher said, the good thing and the bad thing about your book is that it will always be in the news. There's always going to be a story about the police doing this. I wish to God that weren't true. But in fact, the reality is, when my book came out, I was thinking about Eric Garner, who the police thought had committed the horrible crime of selling a single tobacco cigarette on the streets of New York. And in making that arrest, they put him in a chokehold, and like Mr. Floyd, he died. So,
and I got to say, in context of that, we had an oversight committee hearing the other day about the trillions of dollars that we are rightfully necessarily spending to try to get America through this process. But every fiscal expert who spoke to us said there will be billions of dollars lost in self-dealing and corruption, waste, fraud, sweetheart contracts, and abuse. We already saw how Donald Trump's deputy White House chief of staff left the office and 10 days later got a $3 million contract to be in charge of delivering PPEs to Navajo country, and hundreds of thousands of the masks that he provided were faulty, of course. But that's the kind of thing that's taking place. There's this looting from above that's taking place, and nobody's getting arrested for it, So, well, look, I'm told actually that we're going to run out of our time on Zoom, believe it or not, and I feel we've just scratched the surface with both of you. Did you have anything else you wanted to close on, Professor Butler? That was a very moving statement you just made.
Just keep doing what you're doing. The concern is that there are 18,000 different police departments in the United States and 18,000 different ways of policing. No national requirements regarding competency, regarding training, regarding use of deadly force. it's so important for the Congress of the United States to say that this must end. There must be minimum standards for police, people who are licensed to kill. That's the way that Congress can use its authority to make sure that Black lives matter.
That's excellent. And Professor Davis, you get to have the last word, my dear friend. Tell us what you think the people need to be doing at this moment.
Right. You know, I always say to people feel frustrated. They want to know what to do. You know, everybody can't do everything, but everybody can do something. And so it becomes overwhelming. I think everybody should pick the thing they need to do. My white friends who say, what can I do? You know, give a donation, right, to an organization that's doing this work. Even if you can't get out there and physically do things, there's something everybody can do. But I would echo everything that Paul said. And I also want to close by thanking you, my friend, my congressman. So proud to call you my congressman, because keep doing what you're doing. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for all you're doing. You know, I have to believe that things are going to change. You know, I'm not going to give up hope. And it's people like you that give me hope.
Well, thank you, Professor Angela Jordan Davis. You give me hope every day. Professor Paul Butler, thank you for your remarkable contributions. Everybody, please be sure to read his book, which is called Chokehold: Policing Black Men. Professor Davis has a book called Policing the Black Man, and also Arbitrary Justice: The Power of the Prosecutor in America. You're so learned and so erudite, and yet you are speaking to the moment, both of you. Thank you very much. I am deeply grateful to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.